Hello, and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. What does it mean to be culturally competent? How do we practice cultural humility? And how do we better understand working with immigrant populations and client systems very different from our own background? These are questions that systemic therapists, both young and old, continually struggle with. And who better to help us answer that than family therapy pioneer, Dr. Celia Falicov. Large portion of her work has been working with Latino populations, immigrant populations in the United States. In her book, Latinos and Family Therapy, Celia writes, even when freely chosen, the transition of migration is replete with loss. There's a loss of language, separation from loved ones, the intangible emotional vacuum left in the space where home used to be, the loss of community, and lack of understanding of how jobs, schools, banks, and hospitals work. Immigrants are many times rendered vulnerable, isolated, and susceptible to individual and family distress. Celia herself, an immigrant from Argentina, she has an amazing story of perseverance. I'm so happy to bring this to you today. Someone I've never met in person, but had wanted to talk to a long time. And I often say the Pioneer series would not be complete without talking to people like Celia. She's an internationally known family therapist, author, teacher, and clinician. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, currently a clinical professor in the Department of Family and Preventive Medicine, and directs at the University of San Diego in California, and directs a free clinic for immigrant clients. She's a former president of AFTA, the American Family Therapy Academy, a clinical fellow in the AAMFT. She's pioneered many writings on multiculturalism and working with immigrant populations, including the widely praised Latino families in therapy that I mentioned, and also multiculturalism and diversity in clinical supervision. So happy to bring this to you. And after the interview with Celia, I'll be back with exciting news for the AAMFT podcast coming up in the spring of 2021. All right, Celia, welcome to the AAMFT podcast. I have been wanting to talk to you for a long time, and I'm really looking forward to this. So if you've listened to the show, the first question is always, and you have a very unique background. So tell us, because we're going to be talking about cultural competency and really learning a story in your journey and your impact on the field of family therapy. Tell us about your cultural background, your family of origin story, and then what drew you to the family therapy field.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eli, for having me. It's also my pleasure to talk with you and the great work you're doing. I agree with you that students really like to hear podcasts. So who am I? Although I grew up as simply Celia Hayes, that's everybody knows me in my past as Celia Hayes. My complete name is actually Celia Aide Hayes Sisman de Falicov. That sounds like a very long name. 2 Latin first names and 2 Jewish last names. Argentina being the country with the largest Jewish population, you would guess right by my name that I grew up in a Jewish enclave in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. I am the first one born in Argentina. Both my parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. My mother was one of 4 children from Romania at age 15. My father, one of 8, we now think is Ukraine at age 4. They were escaping ethnic and religious persecution and death of the pogroms and the poverty of those Jewish settlements. So from childhood on, I knew that sociopolitical and socioeconomic events shape crucial decisions, such as migrating to unknown and very far away lands, suffering many losses with the hope of survival and perhaps some gains. So I grew up in a very large three-generational family and lived in a highly collectivistic world of my neighborhood. One block away to the right were my maternal grandparents. One block to the left was part of my father's family. My uncles visited almost every day. I loved them and I felt loved by them. I also was very close to my grandparents. But I was the first one to have any education, even grade school. And that was a sort of separation. I spoke a different language and I was learning many things that I could not share. So I went through tremendous contradictions as an adolescent, what I now call roots and wings. I started going to high school away from the Jewish enclave and began to feel also, probably what I might call today a profound sense of shame about being a discriminated minority. I wanted the roots, but also wanted the wings to get away.
You're so youthful. I know I don't want to date you, but you kind of understanding where we are in our kind of political, cultural context of Argentina.
Yes. I'm talking about the 1950s now. And so I grew up during a military dictatorship. That's how I spent my adolescence. I think that also shaped me, in terms of today, and I maybe will go back to that. But so I was saying that education became opened a different world for me. That's how I met my husband in Argentina, who was studying medicine. So in my early 20s, and now we're in the 60s, I migrated to the U.S. with him. He was coming for postgraduate training. And now I think for the first time I could really have even more empathy and respect for the immigrant journey of my parents and my grandparents.
And where did when you came from Argentina, where did you land in the States?
Chicago.
Yes.
Chicago. And it was a gift. I loved being so many years in Chicago. I had to learn English. I had to learn a different lifestyle, different values, and the loneliness of just being there with my husband and no family. I worked as a file clerk, as an EKG technician at the hospital at night. I had not finished my undergraduate degree, which was in any case very different, the educational system in Argentina. So at night I went to Roosevelt University in Chicago, had to learn civics, American geography, American history. But I was able to take the ERE and the Miller-Analogist test, so I was able to apply for graduate school while I was still working full-time.
Now, you talk a lot about the immigrant experience. So you were very close to your family of origin. You followed the American dream. You came over with your husband. What was it like to leave your family back in Argentina?
Well, it was the family and the entire community. I think maybe in my first book on Latinos, there is a section that then I do not repeat in the second book, but you bring back an image very engraved in my mind. I left like an old immigrants did in a mercantile boat that left from the port of Buenos Aires and arrived in South Carolina. And but during that goodbye, that going away, there were enormous numbers of friends, both of my husband's and mine, that followed the boat on the pier until you couldn't see it anymore. And we were all just sobbing.
Like a movie almost. You're painting a picture.
Yes, it was so sad. And they would also be shouting things. Don't forget us. Don't forget Argentine beef. Don't forget to drink mate, which is a typical. So they were just saying goodbye, but at the same time, don't become an American. Always remember us. And it was so painful. I don't know how many days I cried.
Wow.
And so I have a deep empathy for that transition.
So you got here and you got your undergraduate degree. Your husband was a physician. You were learning the language, learning the culture in a great place for Chicago, which as I call my second home. So how did you first, because this is the time now we're in the 60s, right before the golden
Yes.
age of family therapy. It wasn't even really a profession at the time. When is the first time you learn systemic language or you start thinking this is what you're going to do for a career?
Well, let me just say for 1 second something about that transition to school. I never got an undergraduate degree, so I am one of those strange people that I think it was possible at that time to first get a master's in clinical psychology from Loyola University in Chicago, and then was enormously privileged, I think, to be able to get a United States Public Health endowment for 4 years to go to the University of Chicago. And it was an incredibly important marker and one that inspired the rest of my professional life. So it doesn't really start with systemic thinking in a traditional clinical way. Being in human development with a specialty in clinical psychology, human development was a very unique program, a committee of 4 disciplines: biology, anthropology, sociology, and psychology. And this was the beginning of my realization that you need a multidisciplinary approach to understand most human issues. So I learned to think developmentally, culturally, and socially. And so that was how I started to think. My dissertation there, the title was Moving from a Dyad to a Triad. And what I studied was how a couple becomes a family, and interviewed 21 pregnant women. I was the 21st one, and during that transition. So I think I began to think systems then, because I was going from the individual to the family. And I was thinking contextually because of the anthropology and sociology. So I actually became more of a systemic therapist in London because in the early 1970s, I was able to spend a postdoctoral year at the Tavistock Clinic in London. And there I was in a psychoanalytically oriented program. We had a grand rounds as part of that. And the cases they were presenting showed a separation of the child with the therapist. The child with still a separation of this way, let me explain it better. The child was in individual therapy with a therapist, and the parents, or usually the mother, were seeing the social workers. And usually, the mother was always scapegoated and blamed. The mother became the bad mother, and the therapist became the good mother. I felt very disturbed by this split, and I think perhaps because I had my own 2-year-old, that I was feeling guilty about leaving her to be studying and working. So it wasn't right for me to split the children from the parents in the therapy.
What you're talking about is so indicative of our MFT field. If people that listen to the show understand our classic models, our strategic and structural models, there was a lot of this mother bashing going all the way back to the schizophrenic mother, and things that we know today are not true. But you felt it at Tavistock, a wonderful place. We've had guests on the show like Jill and David Scharf talk about their time there. So here you are at this very furtive place for psychotherapy, but the way they were doing the work, it just didn't feel right to you. And you might have not had this systemic language, but it didn't feel like the way you saw helping families.
Yes, and you're completely right. Tavistock is a fantastic place. And I went back as a visiting professor in 2001, and they had one of the components. It's a systemic program, and one, with an emphasis on culture and race. And so Tavistock has also evolved a lot. So while I was there, it was a very, very rich year for me. I became acquainted with the anti-psychiatry movement and was going every Monday night to meetings at their Philadelphia house with R.D. Lang, with David Cooper. But my lucky star shone again there because Sal Minuchin came to the Tavistock on a mini sabbatical, and I began to follow him.
Okay, time out for a second. The amazing history of Argentinian family therapist on the field is amazing. You, Sal Minuchin, Chloe Madonis. Did you know who Sal Minuchin was before he visited that year, or no?
No, no.
Wow.
No, I started meeting him at the cafeteria, and I started asking, can I attend the child psychiatry meetings behind the one-way mirror? And because I wasn't in that program, and they were just child psychiatrists, and so they said, okay. You can go there and be quiet, be silent. You can't participate. You can be an observer. And I, saw him showing videotapes of anorexic adolescents being interviewed with the parents over a lunch hour, something that shocked the young child psychiatrists at Tavistock. But I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I thought it was also marvelous to have this in vivo, supervision, where you actually saw it rather than talking about it. And so that was very attractive to me. And I asked Minuchin where I could learn in Chicago. And he told me that he thought Irving Borstein had started a program on family systems at the Institute for Juvenile Research in Chicago.
IJR, yep.
IJR. So when we returned to Chicago, I became a student first, and while I was working in a community health center with Latino clients. Well, if you've been to Chicago, that's Pilsen, the neighborhood. And at that time, it was already, we're talking about mid-1970s. It was already largely a Latino immigrant place. So I stayed in the family systems program at IGR for 9 years as a student, as a trainer, and later on as the director. There I got to know all the luminaries of those times: Carl Whitaker, Mary Bowen, Virginia Satir. So it was incredibly important to me, and I became a dyed-in-the-wool family therapist with
Yeah, that is a place that the Institute of Juvenile Research that doesn't get, maybe in our textbook and history books, as much credit as it deserves, but amazing integrative thinkers, duals, social workers, MFTs come out of that place. As people like Dick Schwartz spent time at the IJR, Doug Brenlin, Betty McCune, all of my mentors and people that certainly influenced a lot of family thinkers. And Chicago was such, you think of America as the melting pot. There's no greater city to me than a melting pot than Chicago. So what an amazingly clinically rich time. So what you're known for, being multiculturalism, working with Latino families, that is really the origin of this. Because the field at that time, it was so brand new that this idea, working with underserved populations, which, feels like social work, was kind of built in. But for MFT, when you see your classic films, your structural and strategic films, they're usually working the middle class, white, family systems. And obviously Sal's work was pioneering, and the stuff that you were doing, you obviously saw a need to address different populations and start to do this multicultural work. Tell us about the origin of that.
Well, the location of IGR is a very important place, and it tells something about context. We did not, you're completely correct, we did not see middle-class families, perhaps sometimes a lower middle-class family, but it was in the west side of Chicago, and it was, free services for the Cook County, and it was part of a setting of institutions that were in a poor neighborhood. So, we saw basically, underprivileged families that were Latino, whites, poor whites, and blacks. And so I have videotapes of those period where I was seeing all those, families. And so it wasn't, my concentration at that time wasn't necessarily Latinos, was poverty. It was contextual. And so, but the other part that was extraordinary, and I wish that today we would continue that tradition, was all of the sessions were videotaped. So all of the teaching was very clinical and very applied, and you could see what therapists did. And I remember that Harry, I don't know if at that time, was it in a conference or there I asked Harry Aponte, who I had met, like, how did you learn to do this? Because at that time there weren't teachers. People were the pioneers in the field. And he said, I sit down with my videotapes and I watch them a minimum of 10, 11 times. And I always ask myself, what could I have done different? What I could have asked that I didn't ask. And then I went to the next session and I did that. So it was very, very self-taught. And so we had a tremendous advantage of having those videotapes possibilities. And we had a great IT group working with us. I met Jill Metcalf at the time, and she was doing a lot of our videotape work. And I also started writing there.
Yeah. Talk to us about, like you mentioned, all these great names. Harry's been a guest on the podcast. It was such a furtive environment. When you think of other strong females at that time, because you really are on this wave of pioneers, what females did you have connection with and look up to at this time?
Virginia Satir was in town. She was part of a group called Oasis. So I took some workshops there and I volunteered to be in parts of the role play so that I could really feel, how the experiential aspects that she was demonstrating. I met Froma Walsh, who was also in HD, and I think it was very important because she and I and Jill Metcalf, who was a social worker at the time and became a photographer later, we created a little writing group. And that's how we started to look at each other's writings and critique it. We met once a month. And, if I have something to pass on to students, I always tell them, you have to write your experiences. When I traveled, in Latin America or other places, and I say to people, you really have to write what you are thinking, even if you don't publish it, because it becomes clear that way. And it also, you're not always absorbing the literature that comes from white middle class literature, because we then tend to impose that in other contexts where it may apply or it may not apply. So I think I didn't, when you ask about other females, I don't know, Monica McGolrick at that time was writing a book on the family life cycle. And because I was working already with a large Latino population, because I'm bilingual and bicultural in many ways. So, and I think she approached me to see whether I would write a chapter on the family life cycle of Latino families. And I decided to accept it. That was the late 1970s. And I think that probably was one of the first things that I started writing about.
It's interesting because when I think of you, I have been fortunate enough to meet most of the people that I look up to. Is the first time we have talked kind of standard in the training programs I was involved in, and in my training programs I teach. These two books that I certainly connect with you right away, which is Latino Families in Therapy, but also Family Transitions, Continuity and Change over the Life Cycle. So that early life cycle work was inspired by Monica first reaching out to you, huh?
Yes, and also by my, being steeped in human development. Because human development is, as a program, it takes every stage of the life cycle and then looks at every stage from a cultural and developmental point of view. So I was ready for that invitation. But I do have a lot to thank to Monica about the fact that she then continued to invite me to write in her books on ethnicity and family therapy, which became so popular.
Yes, and she was an amazing guest on the show as well. You've brushed paths with so many luminaries. Now, because you have been in the field since really its origin, how do you think family therapy has changed as it pertains to cultural awareness since you entered the profession? Because, you have seen it certainly grow, and what you start as a pioneer on now is hopefully built into our training standards and the way we professionally raise family therapists, so to speak. What are the biggest changes you've seen?
Well, perhaps the biggest ones are that people have a greater awareness of these issues. But if I go back to how we started and where it took me, I don't know how much, it's very hard to know, Eli, how much people read one's work. I'm always surprised when people say, I read this or I read that, because they don't necessarily tell you, you don't necessarily know. So I think at the beginning we had an ethnic specific approach, and that the book I just mentioned, Ethnicity and Family Therapy, and had many editions, was an opening to learning about the possibility that people have different belief systems, different constructions of reality, different worldviews. But in 1983, I edited a small book, a very small book, 120 pages, titled Cultural Perspectives in Family Therapy, with a different approach that defined culture as more multidimensional, that included race, gender, rural, urban, migration, language, religion. And this little book is out of print. But I invited several people that also probably big name. And Jay Lapin had an article there that speaks about the way to know about cultural preferences is with curiosity and respect. Today, this was 1983, but today people are constantly using the idea of curiosity and respect. It's a big change and a good change. Braulio Montalvo and Manuel Gutierrez have a terrific chapter in that little book on using culture as a mask that covers up inequality, social inequality. Guillermo Bernal has an article on class using the differences between urban and rural families. I have an article called The Shifting Family Triangle, questioning triangles, which is very much at the core of understanding lots of things in structural family therapy, by showing how meaning varies when you include culture and context. So it really was a different way of thinking about culture as much more complicated, nuanced, and socially constructed than just a list of ethnic value differences. And I think then say, what is, Monica, you probably know this, re-envisioning?
Yeah, re-envisioning. Culture? Right, yes.
That is a much more current example of how we're thinking. As you probably know, in 1995, I wrote an article in Family Process titled Training to Think Culturally. And here I began my work with integrating migration-specific inquiries and clinical practices. For example, the impact of family separations or family acculturation stressors, because I felt that most of what we had been writing about culture did not include the enormous cultural transition of migration. And I call this framework MECA for I wish I had a simpler, rather than a multidimensional ecosystemic comparative approach. But it represented something that I deeply believed in and now, that we're all very much creatures of our social context, that's what family therapy always represented, and that we not only have to take into account cultural diversity, but also sociopolitical context. And MECA really encompasses both, cultural diversity and social justice. And I expand a lot more on that on the second edition. But, the difference also, Eli, today is that I think we're recognizing that that the therapy encounter is not culturally neutral, that the therapist comes in with its own maps that comes from professional training, the values of our profession that makes us similar in many ways, and also personal. Your personal upbringing that is also cultural, and what you acquired along your life. So, but people talk about that now today, and which is great. But many times they don't really know how to look at their own culture or their own, profession. So I think MECA provides that, because the comparative part of it is about using the same universal dimensions without the content that allows you to compare yourself with your clients.
No, I love all of that. And again, it's all captured in the book in its second edition now. But if we are trying to distill, because a lot of times people like to listen to the podcast and they want to leave it with some skills. So I know we're both clinical trainers, and sometimes when I train professionally young therapists, if they are working with a client or a system with a different ethnicity or cultural experience, they don't want to offend, so they don't mention it at all. And that is, I think, as a supervisor and a trainer, a big missed opportunity to learn, to be curious, to be respectful. So what are some skills, some tips you would give to how MFTs, maybe from the dominant culture, can increase their cultural awareness in their work? So some specific cultural awareness skill building techniques that you could leave our listeners with, Celia.
Well, I mean, it's hard to give, formulas, but I think in Mecca, I look at four things. One is if the family has any migration experiences, which could just simply be relocation by, it's like if you deal with a family that is not an immigrant, you still have transitions that have to do with context. And then you look at where they live right now. What is their context? What is their neighborhood? Where are their issues with, whether they have, what's happening in their neighborhoods? Are they have housing? Do they have any kind of resources? What kind of community they live in? And then I look, and I would consider that understanding more the social context of families. And the other two things that I always look at is at what stage of the family life cycle are they? Do they have young children? Are they elderly people? Do they live in 3-generational settings? And then how are they organized? Are they organized in family organization and collectivistic settings? Are there large families? Are there small families? And so I look at those four things that you study by reading what I write. But I go in always with a both-and attitude, that I know a little bit, knowing that I have to explore these issues, but I also keep the openness of not knowing, that I have to ask about those things, that I don't have to assume. You're right, but I would say about the fact that people are not so good at asking if they are inhibited because of their youth or their lack of experience. But at the same time, if you go back to your previous session and say, I've missed some of the things I wanted to explore, it wouldn't be wrong to say to the family, I've been thinking about you, and I realize that I haven't asked you if religion plays a role in your sense of hope or in your faith, and what's the role of that? Or you could even just say it is an important aspect to me, or it's not so important, and that's why maybe I missed it. So it is part of creating a relationship with your clients. And, it humanizes you to ask. And it is not correct in many ways to assume an expert role rather than the not knowing one.
As long as you can be curious and come from a good place, and the kind of therapeutic contract is to help. So you're asking to understand. And yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I always ask, especially when it's a culture that I don't know about, or if I've worked with clients before, I don't assume that all clients from that ethnic group or that background do it the same way. So, I mean, yeah, being curious is the way to go. However, some young clinicians, they don't want to offend. And I think when you're coming from a place of care, from therapeutic care, it's not offensive to ask a client system about their background, especially if you don't know anything about it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. You asked me something about skills. And
yes.
I think one of the things that has happened, and I hopefully is getting corrected over time, even in the first edition of the Latino book, which came out when 1998, I make a differentiation between cultural diversity and social justice, because they get very conflated, and I think the skills needed to work with cultural diversity are different than the ones they overlap. but they're different.
Oh, please highlight that for us, because I couldn't agree more. And you're right, those often get confused or mixed together.
Yes, yeah. Well, when we talk about cultural diversity, we talk about values, beliefs, meaning differences, and they're usually tied to being responsive to issues of ethnicity, religion, nationality. And when it comes to the clinical practices, you have to start thinking about things like theory transformation. Meaning if your values are more collectivistic rather than individualistic, well, we have to say something about, I just give you a very quick example. Just recently in the clinic where I work, one of the women came to talk about, one of the Latino women talking about how desperate she was about the fact that her daughter was spending a lot of time outside in the street with other kids, and she was very, very worried about it. And she was being interviewed in a health setting where the psychiatrist wanted very kindly to help her, but she kept on talking about the daughter and about her concerns about the daughter. And then the psychiatrist says, you should stop talking about your daughter. You really need to talk about yourself, about how to take care of yourself through this. And, he came from a place of self-care, which was not completely incorrect, but it was ignoring the fact that the main concern was the family for this person, was the impact of this daughter on everybody. So that requires some sense of theory transformation, that you come in with a set of techniques that comes from an individual approach to working with people. And he needed to have more accommodation to cultural differences, and that's cultural diversity, with curiosity, with respect about, what the impact of this was on the mother. And if you go to the social justice side, we need to talk about contextual stressors tied to power differences, to gender, to race, to class. And what it requires in terms of clinical practices, using the client's local knowledge, of which most of the time therapists know less about, is to empower people to have voice when it's not dangerous to have voice, to have cultural resistance to discrimination, to address oppressive practices, always taking into account what the person is willing or able to do. So they are different approaches to clinical practice. And I think that is where the field is going now.
Oh, wonderfully said. And I think you've embodied that, because you have this very right structural background, and you talk about being influenced, captivated by Minuchin, but this very postmodern client is expert to their own experience framework too. So I feel like you've been able, in your own work, in your own writing, been able to marry those two things that are beautiful about our field. What do you think we need to do to keep this momentum going, especially in these crazy times we're living in now, as far as to keep evolving and being curious and having this multicultural perspective? What should happen next? If we look back in this interview in 10 or 15 years, what would you like to say the next evolution of this is?
I think that what has happened with COVID-19 and the disproportionate effects on poor people, people of color, I think that we need to look, first of all, about the fact that class has a color, and the color is brown and black, but it's also poor whites, and we have ignored that. Social class is still largely ignored in our writing and our explicit interventions. It's interesting that I'm often invited to speak by social workers who are at the front line of understanding class inequity, and who are terrific at investigating the impact of these issues by drawing eco maps. And I think we need to understand that there is a very high emotional and developmental price for merely getting by in life with food, housing, something that actually narrows mental bandwidth. And, there's this book called Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. And I think we need to look at those things. A perpetually tired brain of dealing, how to put food on the table, how to put gas in the car, one paycheck away from homelessness. It is very difficult on families. And so we also do not have enough minority faculty, not enough bicultural, bilingual therapists. There's a lot of politics in organizations where we all kind of think alike, but where people turn against each other critically to the detriment of using their strengths to fight the real enemies outside. So I think, in this I know it's very difficult to do what I'm saying, but I feel that we need to begin to look at that more clearly.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't say it any better. You'll have no argument for me on that. Now, it is amazing, like in doing this podcast series, interviewing pioneers for the last 3 years, there's these common factors, these therapist factors, everybody that's doing this. It's not because they're doing it because they still need to. They're not doing it for the money. They are still so passionate. And listening to you this last 40 minutes or so, that is so clear to me. So what does a typical kind of work week look like now? You are still at the University of California, San Diego, and you've been there for a long time. Currently, how do you remain so passionate about this work and still clinically active as well, in addition to writing? What's your driving force now at this stage of your career?
I read a lot. And I read newspapers, and I read books that about real people's experiences. I would like, students to do that, and because they're very inspiring. Reading a book like Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, or J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, or all books like Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dime, Matthew Desmond, Evicted. I think those are very inspiring books about real experiences. I can go on and tell you more of them, old and new. And I draw my inspirations from many things. You asked me before about what are some skills that young therapists should have. So there is a poem by a black woman poet, Pat Parker, that says, if you want to be my friend, the first thing you do is to forget that I'm black. And the second thing that you must never forget is that I'm black. So I feel that that I do that in my current work, that I never forget that I work with a very impoverished Latino immigrant population, but I also connect very much with our shared humanity, with the universals, that are the bridges of human connectedness, like raising children, getting ill and dying, being fearful of things getting worse. I think that kind of human connection keeps me going, and also young people. So I work in a setting that is all medical students from first year to fourth year that have either as an elective or as something they've decided to do on their own, is that they will become doctors, medical doctors in medicine for the underserved. And they are tremendously inspiring. I have great trust in the next generation. And, I also get inspired by my daughters on that. And I think working not in the isolated environment of the private practice, which is inspiring in its own way because you connect with people's, pain and people's hopes and people's resilience. But at this, having an environment that is very committed, to caring for others, that the important thing is patient care. That's keeps me going.
Well, it's your, beautifully said, it's your direct contact still with these client systems. It's also your continue lifelong learner, reading not just about psychotherapy, but all these outside kind of related disciplines or inspiration from stories. And it's your interaction with these med students, the young people that inspire you. So, I mean, to me is how you keep doing it and doing it for the right reasons. Now, we've learned a little bit about, you just mentioned your daughter. it's also interesting when I've done these interviews that many times, like you said, you're always amused and flattered when somebody has read your work because you don't know who reads it or not. Many times people's family of origin have no idea. They just know you as a loving family member or a hard worker, but they have really no idea about your contribution to the field. So what does your family of origin back in Argentina and your family here in the States, what do they know and think about your contributions to our field of family therapy?
Oh, what an interesting question. Haven't thought about it.
Yeah, I know.
But what came to mind first, and, sort of, I do admire Buddhism too. And so I would say, Buddhists say first thought, best thought. So I tell you what my first thought was. That when I became the president of the American Family Therapy Academy, I invited my brother, who was in Miami. And we were at the presidential table, my three girls and my brother. My husband had died already, and so we, everybody said something, some congratulations, and my brother got up with his champagne or something and said, I never knew this aspect of my sister. What I knew always, and I'm the older sister, and was that she was always there for me. That when I called her, no matter how busy she was, I knew she was busy, she has a very busy life, but she always had time for me. And that's what makes her kind of my president. So, that was so touching to me that's really what I think my family and my sister feels the same way. She doesn't know what I do necessarily. She knows that I'm a family therapist. Perhaps they know that I have worked a lot with immigrant Latino populations, but that's about it. I go back to Argentina every year or every other year, and of course my parents are no longer alive, and none of my extended family, my grandparents, my uncles. Now I have a younger a group, of some cousins that are still alive and nephews. I used to go invited, and I always try to combine the personal and the professional on those trips, and I realized that I needed to do less of that, because what I was doing was connecting with a group that would be my reference of what would have happened to me if I had remained in Argentina. So when I was talking about the internal traveling that people do, when you also pass, move from one socioeconomic class to another, or an educational class to another, you have a transition. And so I think I was imagining what it would have been like if I remained in Argentina and became a psychologist there, a family therapist there, which family therapy is very strong in Argentina. But now, in the later years, I just want to see my cousins and I want to see my nieces and my nephews. So I go for weddings, I go for special events.
It's this weird paradoxical feeling to have warm feelings about your family unit, how you were raised, but being so thankful that you left. It's kind of contrasting feelings, but it's clearly influenced who you are and the way you work, and your brother's tribute. Those are your best qualities, your self of therapist, your clinician qualities, that he didn't need to really know the specifics, what you've done or how you've impacted the field. He just knew you were a good and caring, thoughtful person. And here's the last question. You are so accomplished, but also so humble. So this would be a hard question for you. Now that you think of this, at this stage of your career, if you have any goals left, I'm curious what there are, but the legacy question, how do you want to be remembered in the field of family therapy the most?
Oh, I don't know. My first thought was about something about the young people that I'm interacting with. So because they're the people who inspire me now. I just wrote an article on working with under-resourced Latinx immigrants during COVID-19 with two wonderful young women. One is a narrative therapist, the other is an emotionally focused family therapy. And I learned from them. The three of us are committed to social equity and see our work as psychosocial empowerment of clients. Both of them are volunteers at the clinic, at the free community health clinic. So I want to continue to help the development of caring health and mental health practitioners. And and when it comes to the practice of medicine for the underserved, I would like to help integrate the mental health community as equal partners more. Working with under-resourced families that not really patch up the ills of an unjust society. What matters is true policy change. But meanwhile, one cannot just observe human suffering without doing something about it. So I think I heard this from Carl Whitaker a long time ago, that it was a Zen saying, you cannot get it by trying, but you cannot not try. So maybe I'd like to be remembered by that. And I have seen in our field the creation of many schools of family therapy over time, each claiming to cover all the fronts. The truth, in my opinion, is that there is no silver bullet. There is no magic formula. There is a danger of the single story in the field, like in the idea of culture. So I think I would like to be remembered by thinking about issues that encompass all of us in similar and in different ways. Perhaps that is the message of Mecca. It is not a single story about culture or about context. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Oh, yeah, so beautifully done. I have so thoroughly enjoyed this. And if people want to know more about Mecca, they can find everything you mentioned and a whole lot more in Latino Families in Therapy in the second edition, right? That would be the best place to go to learn about the model, right? You're also, so wonderful to dialogue with and so prompt in your feedback. I don't know how you get all of this stuff done, but a lot of times our listeners were like, oh, well, I couldn't possibly reach out to so-and-so. I've read their work and I admire them so much. But if people wanted to drop you a line after they listen to this interview or correspond with you, what's the easiest way to reach you, Celia?
My email?
Yes.
Okay. So C. Falicov. You know how to spell my name?
Yes, I will have it in the link, but you can spell it for everybody. Go ahead.
C as in Celia, F for flower, ALICOV as in Victor, at health dot UCSD for University of California, San Diego, .edu.
Wonderful. I have enjoyed this so much.
And I am actually quite prompt.
You are. I told you are.
Otherwise I forget. So I'd rather just do things when they come.
And you are a master of another way to stay current. And maybe this is because you read a lot or you keep yourself around all these young medical students. But I feel like you've adapted the technology as well. You have some people, they learn a certain way of doing it and then they get to a certain age, or especially in our COVID times, they're like, well, I'm not going to learn this or I learn that. I think another thing that has kept you current is you've adapted to the current technologies and everything we use. But it was a pure joy to talk to you. And I couldn't imagine completing this Pioneer series without having you a part of it.
You must be a good therapist. Nobody ever realized what you just said, but you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Yes. I even just taught myself how to do a complicated spreadsheet the other day. So, and I get some pride out of keeping up with what's happening, even though I'm an old woman. So.
No, that is why you're so vital and such a force in the field. It was so great talking to you.
Eli back with you. So brings to a close another installment of the AAMFT podcast. And one of my favorite parts, the Pioneer series, and truly a pioneer, a female pioneer in systemic thinking, diversity, multiculturalism, Celia Falicov. I really appreciated my time with her, and so humble and so vital. And I told you one of these common factors of the pioneers that chronologically may be senior in our field, but what keeps them young and fresh is their ability to adapt. Celia told you about her love of reading, consuming knowledge. Technologically is up to speed and then some. I love being able to hear these stories and connecting the past. So if you listen to that, maybe you heard about the Institution of Juvenile Research, IJR, for the first time, or you made the connection with all the great family therapists coming out of Argentina or what was going on in the socio-political landscape of the time. Thank you again, Celia, and please check out all of her works. One that we mentioned in the interview that I think holds the test of time, especially if you like cycle type of work, as she mentioned, family transitions, continuity and change over the life cycle, which came out some 30 years ago now, but still a classic in the field and certainly worth checking out in addition to those other publications we mentioned. All right. Here at the podcast, we are always emerging and coming up with new ideas, listening to listener feedback here in our third season. I am so happy to announce one of the feedback is, hey, is there a video version of the podcast? We've heard your voice and heard you interview these people, but some of us are more visual and we'd like to see it. Well, AAMFT and I have partnered together to bring you the AAMFT podcast live series starting in March, coming up soon, featuring the authors from the Handbook of Systemic Family Therapy, which is a groundbreaking reference work on both the profession and the practice of systemic family therapy. The who's who in our field, nationally and internationally, which is a focus of this 4-part series. We are going to really focus on family therapy around the world, especially with underserved populations. These are live, and you want to go to aamft.org to register. Eventually, they will be in our traditional audio podcast form, but you want to get in on this groundbreaking live in real time podcast. We'll start on March 5th. They're on Fridays from 11 to 12 Eastern Time. We're going to be talking with Gwen Daniel about families in chronically unsafe environments. On March 19th, we'll be talking to Lori Charles and Celia Falicov about systemic family therapy and global mental health, reflections on professional development and training. And later on in April, talking to Mudita Rastogi about how to have a systemic conceptualization and interventions with families in this global context. And finally, concluding the series on April 16th, to Corey Yeager and Carlin Tishner on working with African-American client systems. So I'm so excited to bring this to you. As always, we rely on your listener feedback to drive the show and help us rise among the ranks of the Mental Health Podcast. Please find us wherever you download your favorite podcast. I'm partial to Apple Podcasts, but you can find us on Spotify, Stitcher. I really appreciate leaving a star rating and a review. If you want to get a hold of me, it's easy. You can go to EliKaram.com. It's Karam, or you can drop me a line, Eli@North Star Counseling Center. The AAMFT is, of course, at aamft.org, where you can find out the latest and greatest in what's going on in the world of systemic therapy. Follow us on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Eli Live, and the AAMFT is simply at the AAMFT. So whether it's Twitter, email, going to the website, we'd love to hear from you. Stay safe, and until next time, my friends, stay systemic.